Between the spring of 1847 and the bitter winter of 1852, three of the wealthiest plantation families along the Tennessee River Valley in northern Alabama were reduced to hollow names and haunted houses. 23 people connected to those estates died, some carried off by sudden fever, others in accidents that made seasoned overseers cross themselves, and several in ways so unnatural that the county coroner wrote only the Latin phrase, cessatio vitalium in naturalis, and closed the ledgers forever. Local newspapers printed vague paragraphs and then fell silent. Judges sealed testimonies for 110 years. Because every catastrophe, every bankruptcy, every coffin, every midnight scream traced back to one enslaved woman whose name appeared on bills of sale, inventories, and finally on court documents that no white man wanted the world to read. Her name was Rachel. And before I take you mile by mile, death by death, through the slow-motion annihilation of three proud dynasties, I need you to do something for me. If you believe the darkest corners of American history still have lessons that can burn, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear right now. Tap the bell so these stories find you the moment they're ready. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, city, state, country, because some truths travel farther when we know who's carrying them. Now blow out the lamp. The year is 1847, and the river is running black under a storm that hasn't decided whether to break. Limestone County, Alabama, had grown fat on cotton, and the Tennessee River carried the bales south like an artery pumping white gold to New Orleans. Three families sat at the very top of that world. Fairmont Plantation, 2,400 acres, 87 souls in bondage, owned by Samuel Rutledge, South Carolina-born, legislature-connected, and sliding quietly toward ruin on a tide of cards and brandy he refused to admit was there. His wife Catherine, Virginia gentry by blood and affectation, kept the facade polished while the cracks widened. Their daughter Lydia, 19, romantic, sheltered, and already merchandise in her father's unspoken marriage negotiations. 5 miles upriver stood Riverside, newer brick, smaller acreage, but the home of James Havill, 43, county magistrate, aspiring state senator, a man whose reputation was the only currency he could not afford to lose. His wife Margaret, 10 years younger, still believed her husband's ambition would carry them higher. And finally Oak Ridge, 1,800 acres run with almost military severity by the widower Daniel Crenshaw, 51, a man who had buried his wife in 42 and buried every soft emotion with her. Profit was God, efficiency was Scripture, and his 3 grown children, Margaret, William, and young Samuel, had been raised to worship both. In April 1847 Samuel Rutledge rode to Mobile on business and stopped at one of the largest estate auctions the port had ever seen. 37 human beings stood on the block that day. One listing caught his eye. Rachel. Female. Approximate, 24. House-trained, literate in English and French, accomplished needlewoman and musician. Offered by decree of probate court. Special condition, purchaser must remove her no fewer than 100 miles from the city of Mobile. Price, $400. 400. When a woman with half her skills brought 1,200 or more. Samuel's mind raced with practical advantages. Catherine needed someone to polish Lydia for the marriage market. A French-speaking, refined servant would silence every snide whisper from the older families. The low price and the distance clause smelled of scandal, but the auctioneer swore it was merely an executor's quirk. Paper was signed, coin changed hands, and 3 weeks later a tall, light brown-skinned woman stepped down from the wagon at Fairmont with the calm of someone who had already measured every soul waiting for her. Catherine Rutledge took one look and declared her perfect. For 6 weeks the house ran smoother than it ever had. Rachel's hands never idle, her tongue never sharp, her memory perfect. She taught Lydia French verbs and the subtleties of lacework while somehow knowing exactly which servant needed gentler handling and which guest preferred coffee a shade cooler. Then the temperature inside Fairmont began to drop, degree by invisible degree. Lydia started seeking Rachel out for hours at a time. The two would fall silent the moment another white face appeared. Servants began speaking in lower voices. The very dogs seemed uneasy. Rachel had begun her quiet survey. She asked the cook which planters paid debts on time. Asked the driver which young masters drank too deep. Asked the washerwoman which daughters cried themselves to sleep over arranged courtships. Each question sounded innocent. Together they were a topographical map of power, debt, and desire across the county. She learned Samuel kept a private ledger in the bottom drawer of his study, numbers that would have shamed him in front of every man at the courthouse. She learned Catherine's gracious smile cost more than the plantation could afford. And she learned that Lydia, dreamy, unread, and utterly powerless, was a locked door waiting for the right key. By the first week of July, Rachel was indispensable. Catherine planned dinners around her advice. Samuel found accounts balanced with almost magical precision. Lydia called her "my dearest friend" when no one else could hear. On the night of July 14, 1847, Samuel sat alone in his study staring at columns of red ink that spelled the end of everything he had inherited. Rachel entered with coffee, set the tray down, and paused at the door. "Forgive my boldness, sir. At dinner you mentioned the Havill family. When I was in Mobile I served in a house that had dealings with Mr. Havill's brother. There are circumstances regarding their finances you might find worth knowing." Samuel looked up, eyes sharp with the hunger of a drowning man offered rope. He motioned her to the chair opposite his desk, something no white man in Limestone County had ever done with an enslaved woman. For the next hour Rachel recited dates, amounts, names of failed speculations, hidden second mortgages, partnerships with men currently hiding from creditors in Texas. She spoke like a lawyer reading evidence. Samuel's desperation overpowered every instinct that should have asked how a house servant possessed intelligence that would ruin a magistrate. When she finished he had already decided to use the information to blackmail James Havill into saving Fairmont. He did not see that he had just sold his soul to a woman who had spent the previous 8 years reducing 3 other planter families to ash, and who had been forced 100 miles from Mobile because authorities finally noticed the bodies piling up behind her but could find no law she had broken. That same night lightning split the ancient oak beside the great house clean in two, as though the sky itself marked the date. 8 days later Samuel rode to Riverside under pretense of discussing a shared cotton gin. After pleasantries he mentioned, almost casually, certain disturbing reports about Havill's 1845 land deals in Mississippi Territory. He recited figures only an insider could know. Havill's face went the color of tallow. Exposure would end his political dreams and probably land him in debtor's prison. Samuel proposed a partnership, generous on the surface, lethal underneath. $3,000 from Havill to cover Samuel's debts, public support from Samuel for Havill's Senate ambitions, and absolute silence about the past. Blackmail wearing Sunday clothes. Havill understood. After 30 minutes of strained smiles they shook hands. Samuel rode home convinced he had saved his family. Rachel greeted the news with the smallest tightening at the corner of her mouth and said nothing about the fact that every detail she had given Samuel came not from Mobile society but from the invisible river of talk that flowed between kitchens, quarters, and fields, talk white families assumed never left the yard. Word spread fast among the enslaved. Old Bess, the cook, watched Rachel with growing dread. "That woman ain't natural," she whispered one night. "My cousin Adeline worked for a Creole family down in Mobile. Told me about a girl just like her. 3 big houses fell. People died strange. And nobody ever proved nothing. The others laughed it off. Rachel had done nothing openly wrong. She had simply become the master's favorite. They did not know she had already begun the second movement of her symphony. Throughout August the French and needlework lessons with Lydia continued, but the curriculum changed. Rachel began, ever so gently, to speak of the cages polite society built for its own daughters. Of futures decided in ledgers rather than hearts. Of how a woman could be sold by marriage as surely as by auction block. Lydia had never heard such things named aloud. The words landed like cool water on burns she had carried in silence. One afternoon in the little sewing room Rachel said softly, "Your father has already chosen the men you will marry, Miss Lydia. Thomas Crenshaw. Have you been asked what you want?" Lydia's needle froze mid-stitch. "How could you possibly know that?" "I dust his study every morning. The letters are there. Thomas drinks. He gambles. But his father has capital your father needs. Your wishes are not part of the arithmetic." It was not yet final, but Rachel spoke with calm certainty, knowing Lydia's imagination would do the rest. "I do not love him," Lydia whispered. "Love is not required, Miss Lydia. You are inventory. Valuable inventory, but inventory all the same. In that, you and I are not so different." Over the following weeks Rachel watered every seed of resentment she found. She taught Lydia to keep a secret diary. Fed her phrases about natural rights and the tyranny of fathers. painted vivid pictures of women who disappeared into northern cities and lived by their own names. She was forging ideological gunpowder, grain by careful grain. Meanwhile, the partnership between Samuel and Havel began to rot. Havel, humiliated, found ways to delay payments. Rachel helpfully warned Samuel that Havel was now whispering about Samuel's own gambling debts. Samuel's rage detonated at the September meeting of the Agricultural Society. Two prominent men screaming accusations in front of the county's elite. The scandal was delicious and irreversible. On September 18, 1847, Lydia Rutledge vanished from Fairmont. She left a note written in a hand that was hers but words that were not: declarations of independence, female autonomy, refusal to be property. Catherine read it and felt ice water pour down her spine. Those were not her daughter's thoughts. The plantation erupted. Search parties rode night and day. Newspapers carried notices. Rewards climbed. Every enslaved person was questioned, some were whipped until the blood ran. Rachel wept the prescribed tears and claimed complete ignorance. 3 weeks of chaos produced nothing but gossip and ruin. Havel spread word that the Rutledges could not even control their women. The truth was colder. Lydia had not fled alone. Rachel had spent months preparing her mind, then connected her to a clandestine chain of free black teamsters and runaways who moved at night. Lydia believed she was claiming freedom. She had actually been maneuvered into an act that would mortally wound her family while leaving Rachel untouched by suspicion. And while the Rutledges chased shadows, Rachel had already chosen her next battlefield. She had met Daniel Crenshaw at an August church picnic and let him see exactly enough of her intelligence to spark desire. The widower, always hunting efficiency, decided Oakridge needed her. In late September, while Samuel drowned in paranoia and expense, Crenshaw rode over with $900 cash, more than double what Samuel had paid, and took possession of Rachel. On October 3, 1847, she left Fairmont forever. Behind her the Rutledge name lay in ruins, daughter gone, reputation shredded, finances collapsing, Catherine's nerves shattered. Old Bess watched the wagon disappear down the river road and crossed herself twice. "Lord have mercy on the Crenshaw family," she muttered. Death just changed houses. The early October rains came hard and continual, turning roads to gumbo and isolating each plantation like islands. In that isolation Rachel began her study of Oakridge. Daniel Crenshaw ran his empire with joyless precision. Sentiment had been buried with his wife. His children, Margaret, 23, sharp and suspicious, William, 21, dutiful but secretly in love far beneath his station, and young Samuel, 19, idealistic and quietly questioning the world he had inherited, had been raised to value reason above all else. Rachel saw immediately that Oakridge would not fall to flattery or romance. Daniel respected only results. So she became the perfect machine. Within weeks she balanced household books better than any overseer, found savings in places no one had thought to look, quoted cotton futures with eerie accuracy. Daniel began asking her opinion on crop rotation, on new equipment, on market trends. This displacement infuriated Margaret, who had managed the house since age 17. One November evening she warned her father. "Do you not find it odd that a woman sold so cheaply possesses an education finer than mine? The Rutledges bought her and within months their world burned. Call it coincidence if you like, father, but I smell smoke." Daniel dismissed it as female imagination. Margaret said no more, but her eyes never left Rachel again. She noticed small things, how Rachel's gaze tracked every conversation, how her questions to field hands always circled money and marriage, how she seemed to know the contents of sealed letters. Nothing provable, but the certainty grew inside Margaret like a tumor. Rachel's strategy this time required patience. Daniel had no vanities to stroke. His children had been taught to distrust feeling. She needed structural cracks. She found them in December in the private loan papers, small, regular borrowings at punishing interest. Daniel was overextended and hiding it. By Christmas she knew why. He was secretly negotiating for prime bottomland that would nearly double Oakridge but required cash he did not have. He was gambling everything on cotton staying sky high. Valuable intelligence, but not yet decisive. The final piece arrived in January 1848 when a desperate James Havel came courting Daniel for a new partnership. Rachel served coffee that afternoon and heard every word. Havel offered generous terms because he was drowning. Daniel was tempted because the cash would let him close on the bottomland without his children ever knowing how deep the debt ran. After Havill left, Rachel found a moment alone with Daniel and, voice trembling with perfectly feigned concern, warned that Havill had ruined Rutledge through deliberate deception and would do the same to him. Over the next days she fed just enough doubt to poison the deal. Havill rode away furious, convinced the Rutledges had turned Crenshaw against him. Rachel now had all three families locked in mutual hatred. But the true devastation needed one more secret. William Crenshaw had been secretly married for weeks to Anna Pritchard, a shopkeeper's daughter, who was now pregnant. William planned to present the marriage as fait accompli. Rachel learned every detail through the servant network. On February 19 she arranged for Daniel to open a letter from Anna at exactly the moment William was away. The explosion tore the family in half. Daniel disinherited William on the spot and threw him off Oakridge that night with nothing but the clothes on his back. The Crenshaw unity, their proudest strength, cracked wide open. Still Rachel pressed the blade. In March 1848 a New Orleans creditor named Josiah Fletcher arrived demanding immediate payment of $8,000 on Daniel's secret loans. Daniel had no choice but to sell 20 enslaved people, mothers from children, husbands from wives, in a rushed, brutal auction. Rachel watched the families torn apart with no flicker of emotion. She had orchestrated the timing through contacts who knew exactly when to call the debt. Margaret was at the sale and, for one heartbeat, saw pure calculation cross Rachel's face. That night she confronted her in the dim pantry. "You did this. My brother banished. My father humiliated. The sale. All of it." Rachel met her gaze without blinking. "Miss Margaret, I am property. Property cannot orchestrate anything. Your family's wounds are self-inflicted. You are a devil, and I will see you hang." Rachel's smile was small and terrible. "To prove that, you would have to stand before the county and admit an enslaved woman outwitted every white mind in it. That your father was led by the nose by his own slave. Tell me, Miss Margaret, do you think white pride will allow that confession?" Margaret had no answer. Rachel was right. By spring 1848 the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 leading families shattered in under a year, every catastrophe touching the same enslaved woman. Yet impossible to ignore was not the same as impossible to deny. Alabama law had no crime called being too intelligent while owned. Rachel now prepared the endgame, deaths that even white men could not dismiss as coincidence. James Havill's last hope appeared in June 1848, Edmund Fairbanks, a reputable mobile cotton factor with capital and European connections. Negotiations went well until Havill, desperate to impress, bragged about the brilliant servant at Oakridge who understood business almost supernaturally. Fairbanks asked to meet her. In a private parlor Rachel calmly recited proof that Havill was trying to trap Fairbanks into carrying massive hidden debts. Dates, amounts, forged collateral, everything. Fairbanks demanded documentation Havill could not produce. The partnership died on the spot. Word spread that James Havill was commercial poison. Havill's rage zeroed in on Rachel. He stormed to Oakridge demanding she be whipped. Daniel refused, admitting he too had been played was unthinkable. The public shouting match killed any possibility of future alliance among the 3 families. Havill dug into Rachel's past and uncovered the trail of ruin stretching back to Louisiana. He took his findings to the sheriff. The lawman spread his hands. What crime, exactly? No theft, no poison, no violence. Just white men making bad decisions after listening to a clever slave. There's no statute for that, Mr. Havill. In August Havill offered $2,500 cash for Rachel. Daniel refused. Havill then petitioned the court to remove her from the county as a public menace. The judge denied it with dry amusement. If intelligence enslaves is grounds for banishment, gentlemen, half our best artisans would have to leave Alabama tomorrow. On the night of September 14, 1848, Havill hired 4 men to kidnap Rachel and carry her to Texas where her history was unknown. The enslaved community had been warned. The kidnappers walked into an ambush of hoes, axes, and fury. 2 were badly hurt, the others fled. Daniel Crenshaw ran out with a shotgun. 1 wounded man confessed Havill's name. The magistrate was arrested for attempted theft of property. The irony was exquisite. Rachel saw her opening. She convinced young Samuel Crenshaw, the idealistic 19-year-old who had fallen quietly, hopelessly in love with her, that another, deadlier abduction was planned and that only immediate flight north could save her life. It was a lie, but Samuel believed it with every romantic fiber. He began secretly arranging horses, safe houses, forged passes. When the plans were far enough along to destroy the Crenshaw name if discovered, Rachel betrayed him completely. She carried every incriminating letter, some in her own perfect forgery, to Daniel, presenting herself as the loyal servant who had uncovered treason. Daniel confronted his youngest son that night. Samuel confessed everything: love, moral horror at slavery, the escape plot. Daniel had him committed to a private asylum near Tuscaloosa as a lunatic and sold Rachel the very next day to a trader bound for Mississippi. On November 8, 1848, chained in a coffle of 15 others, Rachel looked back once at the Crenshaw family lined up on the gallery, Daniel rigid with rage, Margaret vindicated but hollow, young Samuel's absence a fresh wound, and spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "Everything I did, you made necessary." Most people assumed the terror had finally been sold away. They were wrong. 15 days later, on November 23, James Havill was found in his locked study with a bullet through his right temple, pistol in his hand, suicide note blaming ruin and the coming trial. His wife Margaret refused to believe it. Key financial papers were missing. The wound seemed wrong for a left-handed man. And James had been drafting a new defense only days earlier. The sheriff ruled suicide and privately thanked God the scandal would die with him. Margaret hired Abraham Cornwall, ex-Pinkerton, to investigate not just the death but the entire chain of catastrophes. Cornwall's December report was a cold blade. The woman known as Rachel has, over a decade, systematically destroyed no fewer than 6 prominent Southern families using nothing but selective truth, superior timing, and an intellect none of her owners thought to fear. She commits no crime the law recognizes because the law refuses to recognize her as capable of crime. On Havill's death he wrote, "I cannot prove murder, but someone with intimate knowledge of that house arranged for despair, or a bullet, to find him that night." The legislature debated new laws against seditious manipulation by slaves, and recoiled. Such laws would mean admitting slaves possessed dangerous rationality, the very idea the system existed to crush. On January 17, 1849, Daniel Crenshaw was crushed inside his own cotton gin. Ruled accident. Margaret knew better. A former field hand sold months earlier had visited that morning with a message from Rachel. The men vanished immediately after. The trader denied sending him. The sheriff admitted privately he believed murder but had no evidence, only pattern. On May 2, 1849, young Samuel Crenshaw hanged himself with knotted bedsheets in the asylum. Margaret Crenshaw received the news empty of tears. Father dead. One brother exiled in poverty. The other by his own hand. The proud house of Crenshaw was ash. She bought a pistol, rode to Texas, and went to kill Rachel herself. She arrived at Henry Dalton's plantation only to learn Rachel had been sold 3 weeks earlier, this time to a widow near New Orleans. The widow's name, Elise Delacroix, remarried wife of the very first planter Rachel had destroyed in Mobile. The circle closed like a noose. Margaret reached the Delacroix estate on June 24, 1849, pistol loaded, heart iron. When Rachel entered the lakeside parlor her eyes held no triumph, only recognition and something that might have been sorrow. "I knew someone would come," she said quietly. "I did not expect it would be you, Miss Margaret." What followed was a 3-hour conversation that would haunt every person who later read the transcript. Rachel told the truth of her birth, free in Richmond, daughter of a skilled free black craftsman and a French mother, educated, comfortable, until white creditors forged papers and stole her freedom after her father's death. From free citizen to property in one court session. "I was taught I was fully human," she said. "Then white men decided I was not. So I decided if I could not be free, I would make them pay for believing themselves untouchable." She laid out her method with chilling clarity: study each family for months, map every weakness, earn trust through real brilliance, then deploy truth like artillery until the family destroyed itself from the inside, always leaving no legal trace. She admitted arranging the circumstances of every death without ever lifting a hand, information placed so that others, with their own grievances, would act. When Margaret asked about young Samuel, Rachel's voice finally broke. "His death was not intended. That one I regret." Margaret raised the pistol. Rachel did not flinch. Elise Delacroix revealed she had bought Rachel not for labor but for answers, and that Rachel had spent weeks writing an 80-page confession, every technique, every philosophical indictment of the system that created her. Margaret lowered the gun. Killing Rachel would change nothing. The confession would live. And there would be others. Instead, she took the confession back to Alabama, determined to force the South to look at what one enslaved woman had done to its proudest sons. The legislature passed vague, toothless laws in 1850. Rachel vanished from the record, sold again, escaped, or simply swallowed by the anonymous millions, no one knows. The family she broke never recovered. The confession gathered dust until the 1960s. Scholars who have read it call it the most sophisticated act of individual resistance in American slavery. One passage is carved into academic memory. I could have poisoned them one by one and been replaced by new owners. Instead, I chose to prove that our minds are the weapon you can never chain. I wanted them to fear what we think more than what we might do with our hands. So tell me, down in the comments, no filters, no safe answers. Was Rachel justified, or was she a monster? Could you condemn her if you had worn her chains? And if this story left ice in your veins and fire in your mind, subscribe, turn on the bell, share it with someone who still believes history is clean. Because some truths only travel in the dark. I'll see you in the next one. Stay afraid of what we're capable of when we're pushed far enough.